We're all set? Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this panel discussion on Engin Aysen's most recent book titled Citizenship. The key question driving our discussion tonight is a provocative question raised by the book. Can there be a planetary citizenship? It's a provocative question, but it's not a surprising one if you consider Aysen's over 3 decades of work reflecting on the meanings of citizenship. We tend to think of citizenship as a legal status that one holds in a given state, a status that's associated with a national identity and that comes with a series of rights and duties. Aysen's work has challenged us to see citizenship much beyond that, as an institution that shapes all of us as political beings, whether we are aware of it or not. He encourages us to see citizenship as a Janus-faced institution or an apparatus that can be deployed both by privileged groups for the sake of domination and by marginalized or excluded groups for the sake of emancipation. Aysen's work has been particularly influential in unpacking citizenship's latter phase of emancipatory potential. His more historical studies on citizenship stress the role of all those who were cast as the strangers, the outsiders, the aliens, precisely those who were not recognized as citizens, as the ones pushing for citizenship's historical expansion and for its promise of liberation. Aysen's reflections on our current political context similarly illuminate the disruptive and revolutionary agency of illegalized migrants, refugees, indigenous, transgender groups, and many others who position themselves as citizens with the right to claim rights, regardless of whether they are formally recognized as such. Arguably, however, and as Aysen points out, citizenship's face of domination has become increasingly prevalent in recent years. All over the world, we see citizenship being deployed by dominant groups holding tight to their privileges in militarized ways. Citizenship is being deployed to bolster white supremacist and other ethno-nationalist ideologies, to stigmatize, cage, and eliminate those portrayed as the others, the strangers, and the aliens. It is in this dire context in which we find ourselves that Aysen asks if it can't be otherwise. Can citizenship be rescued from the right? Can it be deployed as a unifying language and imaginary, bringing together transversal progressive movements such as the movement for climate justice, Black Lives Matter, No One is Illegal, and many others? Can citizenship allow these diverse movements to imagine a planetary political community that knows no borders and that's made up of both humans and non-humans? I hope you are as intrigued and excited about these questions as I am. So let me introduce you to the panelists who will be tackling them tonight. Engin Aysen, whose vast and field-defining theoretical work I've just tried to give you a glimpse of, is Professor Emeritus of International Politics at Queen Mary University of London. He'll give a short presentation of his book before the panel discussion. As our panelists, we have Stefania Milan, who is Professor of Critical Data Studies at the Department of Media Studies at the University of Amsterdam. She's also a research associate with the chair in AI and Democracy at the Florence School of Transnational Governance of the European University Institute. Christina Krause is an anthropologist at the University of Amsterdam, working at the intersection of political and medical anthropology. Last but not least, we have Darshan Vigneswaran. Oh, I've practiced so much and I said it wrong. Vigneswaran, who is co-director of the Institute for Migration and Ethnic Studies. He's also associate professor in the Department of Politics at the University of Amsterdam and senior researcher at the African Center for Migration and Society at Wits University. I'll be the panel's moderator tonight. My name is Joana Zaka Tomás, and I'm an assistant professor in the sociology department at the University of Amsterdam. After the panel, we'll open up for some Q&A from you all. I'd like to thank you for being here tonight, SPOUT 25 for hosting us, and the Amsterdam Research Center for Migration at the UvA for sponsoring this event. Aysen, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Gianna, for that introduction and also setting the stage. I'm really grateful for that. I'd like to express my deepest gratitude to her, as well as the University of Amsterdam, for inviting me and organizing this event. I also want to thank Christina, Stefania, and Darshan for joining us for this conversation. I'm really grateful for your presence. A special thank you also goes to SPAO 25 for hosting this event as a venerable institution. I have a knowledge of its history. I have been here before, and I feel really privileged to be back here. And I'm also grateful to everyone who's attending the event in person or has joined us online. Let me provide some background on the book rather than speaking or presenting the book itself. We're going to hear from our speakers their views on the book, but I just want to give, for our discussion, a background against which it was written. As you may know, I have been writing about citizenship for nearly 35 years, and these years have spanned the 20th and 21st centuries, and they have been marked by significant global events. We have witnessed the disintegration of empires and the emergence of nationalist movements, similar to those that occurred between the two world wars of the 20th century. These movements, nationalist movements, have also mobilized religious and ethnic identities against the background of the intensification of globalism and globalization, using World Economic Forums as their organizing platform. So the globalism and nationalism are not necessarily opposite events, but actually feeding off each other and relating to one another. In the midst of that, various international movements, including anti-racist, anti-capitalist, anti-colonialist, decolonial, migrant, ecological, feminist, indigenous, and queer movements emerged against this simultaneous nationalization and globalization. These movements, international movements, have mostly mobilized by making international human rights claims and using typically, especially in the early years, World Social Forums as their organizing platforms and the United Nations as their juridical political instrument. Over the past 4 decades, the United Nations has enacted numerous declarations to protect and implement the rights that these international movements have mobilized. What were these rights? Some rights are considered inherent and inalienable, meaning they belong to every individual, every one of us, simply by virtue of being human, regardless of our nationality, ethnicity, religion, or social class, sometimes called fundamental rights. These human rights originate from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. But often, they're also traced back to the French Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, 1789, as well as the Declaration of Independence of the United States of America, 1783, and the British Bill of Rights, 1689, and even further back, but these are the benchmarks of the emergence of inalienable rights. However, the relationship between citizenship rights and human rights remains ambiguous, if not contradictory, in these earlier declarations, which we will revisit in a moment. Now, human rights enacted by the United Nations increasingly expanded to civil, political, social, cultural rights, such as women's rights, indigenous rights, gender rights, the right to education, language rights, and children's rights. They have been enacted through various instruments and mechanisms that collectively constitute an international human rights law. These include covenants, treaties, and conventions over the last 5-6 decades. Examples are the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights was enacted in 1976, and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights also in 1976. We can also add Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples in 2017, or the Global Compact for Safe, Orderly and Regular Migration in 2018 for migrant rights. There are also regional charters supplement and complement the international human rights law by protecting and promoting human rights in specific areas of the world. These include the European Convention of Human Rights in 1953, American Convention on Human Rights for the Americas in 1978, and the African Charter on Human Rights, on Human and People's Rights for Africa, 1986. Now, those of you who are familiar with the classics of citizenship literature will recognize that these rights that I mentioned are what a British sociologist, T.H. Marshall, thought how modern citizenship rights developed since the 18th century. It was Marshall, this sociologist, who sequenced the development of civil rights in the 18th century, political rights in the 19th century, and social rights in the 20th century. But writing in 1948, the year when the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was passed or declared, he thought these rights as citizenship rights. Now we might ask, what remains the substantive difference between human rights and citizenship rights? If the juridical political expansion since 1948, particularly since 1989, has made it impossible to conceptually differentiate them, have we just simply named citizenship rights as human rights? Are they identical? In appearance, in their protection and the guarantees, they appear to be identical set of rights. There is, however, a significant practical difference between the articulation and enforcement of these rights. International covenants, conventions, treaties, and charters develop principles, but can only encourage or coerce states to sign up to them and then implement and enforce them. While sovereign states are bound by international treaties, they are not obligated to comply with them even if they have signed them. So we have human rights and citizenship rights speaking technically the same language, but those that are deemed to be as human rights cannot actually be enforced in any consistent global way. So then, if the sovereign state still remains the source of authority and legitimacy that produces the force of law, enacting and protecting citizenship rights, then what is the source of authority and legitimacy for the rights of people as humans? Where does that authority and legitimacy come from as a force? There is a contradiction because there is none. This contradiction is that without the force of law, sovereign state human rights laws remain unenforceable. In other words, to be human, one first needs to be a citizen. However, the most endangered people are those without citizenship or state protection. How are they to be protected? This contradiction between citizenship rights and human rights has been pointed out for nearly 2 centuries because international human rights cannot be enforced or implemented unless guaranteed by national citizenship rights. Thinkers like Jeremy Bentham and Edmund Burke in the 19th century and Hannah Arendt in the 20th century reflected on the contradiction between human and citizenship rights. A number of philosophers in the 20th century, ranging from Jean-François Lyotard, Jacques Derrida, Giorgio Agamben, Etienne Balibar, Jacques Rancière, and Slavoj Žižek, each in their own way also responded to Arendt and tried to tackle this contradiction. Sometimes it's called aporia, sometimes called impossibility of reconciling citizenship rights and human rights. Now, we might think that the last 35 years have shown this contradiction time and again. Many international movements remain fragmented and disconnected, each locked in a national citizenship regime unable to defend and protect these rights as human rights. I'm going to give 3 examples. One, consider displaced peoples. There are over 100 million forcibly displaced people and about 90 million internally displaced people across the world. Who protects their international human rights? Who, for example, protects the international human rights of Palestinian people in Gaza and the West Bank? There isn't really any protection that is enforceable. Consider gender rights. Despite international movements, transgender people's rights remain precarious, subject to sovereign state laws. And unless they are protected by these sovereign state laws, on paper, their rights across the globe don't really have the enforcement that need, the legitimacy and authority that they require. Despite international movements, transgender people's rights remain still precarious. And similarly, despite or against international movements, women's rights remain precarious as well, whether in Iran or the United States. And finally, consider environmental rights of peoples and ecosystems. Again, despite or against international ecological movements, the rights of animals and other non-human species and beings remain precarious. So then this contradiction between citizenship rights and human rights is not only logical, but also practical and raises challenging questions in the last 4 decades. Moreover, I want to mention 2 things that make this contradiction even more urgent to think about. First, it has become evident in the last 30, 35 years that international human rights law has also been used as a strategy of imperialism to impose a specific image of law globally. Wars and foreign policies have been waged in its name. Yet states, particularly European and American empire states, have continually undermined international human rights law while claiming to defend it and selectively breaching it. To put it differently, when it serves strategic ends, international human rights are advocated, invading Afghanistan, for example, or sanctioning and starving particular states and peoples like Iran. When it doesn't serve these strategic ends, they are conveniently breached. For example, EU or US amnesia about refugee rights, or Israel's illegal occupations in Palestine. The second development in the last 30, 40 years is that we now face the Anthropocene, a condition where we are not only making rights claims about humans, but also non-humans as co-inhabitants of the earth. Whether we officially name our century as the beginning of a new geological era, as geologists and others are trying to do, or we use Anthropocene as a figure of our times, what it signifies is that humans have become the single most influential agent in destroying its ecosystems and indeed planetary systems and colonization of space. This shift requires questioning even being human, the meaning of being human. Therefore, decentering humans as the dominant species on the planet Earth and recentering the question of belonging to the Earth now with all species for collective survival. What is the influence, what is the effect of this for us to think of ourselves as co-inhabitants of the Earth, to which we are not accustomed to in either international law, let alone national laws? What are we facing now? This is how I put it in the book, more or less. So now we are faced with the question of whether the rights of beings, including in alphabetical order, animals, children, gays, indigenous peoples, lesbians, migrants, minorities, mothers, mountains, paupers, plants, prisoners, protesters, refugees, rivers, robots, slaves, transgender people, trees, women, and workers. How are these to be recognized by, or protected or guaranteed by national, international, supranational, or human rights laws? And the source of authority and legitimacy of such laws. This presents itself now in the 21st century as a political question. Clearly, I must say this, the juridical political invention of the 15th century in Europe, the popular sovereignty or people's sovereignty, on which all nationalisms are based, is a disaster to respond to this question, as it never imagined the rights of all beings and species of the planet. Now, these are complex questions that demand our attention in this century. To address them effectively, we must now reevaluate how rights are articulated, attributed, and inhabited. The primary mechanism for this has been the institution of citizenship, long before the name human rights actually was invented. Citizenship in this form has a history spanning at least 2,500 years, if not 6,000 years, since the emergence of political organization around the world, like cities, states, and empires. By examining its historical and geographical continuities and discontinuities, we now have to assess its possibilities and limitations to respond to the challenge I just outlined. This is the task the book sets itself for. While its analysis is historical, it is by no means a history book. Instead, it develops a concept of citizenship through a robust analytical method. And this method explores how the language of citizenship has remained consistent over at least 2,500 years, yet evolved, its contradictions, its roles, its in social and political life, and the diverse ways of its institutionalization, the ways in which we inhabit that particular name, citizen, when we are called for it. And the book is in the last 30, 35 years, is the result of a collaborative efforts of numerous colleagues and activists, both online and offline across the globe, on studying and performing citizenship. And it tries to synthesize this experience and knowledge to present a concept of citizenship. Can an imaginary or planetary citizenship as a transversal movement coalesce the international movements mentioned earlier into an effective force and source of authority against nationalism? Can making citizenship right claims transform international movements into planetary movements? These are the questions the book ends with. I'm now eagerly waiting to see what my colleagues and you will think of it. Thank you.
So, thank you very much, Engin and Diana and organizers of this session. It is a great pleasure, and I'm really humbled and honored to be here commenting on the work of a scholar that has really guided my thinking and shaped my thinking over the years. More recently, I was greatly influenced by your writing on the politics of data, on sensory power. I don't know whether you're familiar with it. Slightly different from this, but I see a lot of connection. And in fact, given that was the part that has been so influential to my work so far, I'm going to try to connect it in my comments. And if I have to give a title to the few notes that I would like to share with you tonight, the title might be something like Enacting Citizenship in the Age of Data Infrastructure. So I understand all of us are going to take the discussion in a slightly different direction, very different, as you will see. But this is what I have for you tonight. I hope it's not going to be too boring. Coming from the perspective of critical data studies, whatever that is, and political sociology, I want to offer a reading of the book that connects the notion of planetary citizenship to the current moment, a moment where citizenship is increasingly shaped, even governed, I would say, by data infrastructure. What are data infrastructures? I call them actually regulatory data infrastructure, and by that I indicate actually a pretty broad set of technologies that we hold very close to us. Think about, for example, the mobile phone, the smartphone, but they connect all the way to, for example, cloud computing centers and the invisible infrastructure of our digital society that generate data in real time, and this data is used to feed back the system and shape what we can do as citizens, but also what the state, as we used to know it, can do. So eroding, for example, sovereignty in favor of the industrial infrastructure that empowers this data infrastructure, but also ultimately increasing inequality. So this is what my work is about, and I'm going to try to create a connection. So ISIN challenges the view of citizenship as a fixed legal status, building on all the movements that you have mentioned. And you emphasize how people become citizens and imagine citizenship in different ways, also reclaiming rights, performing belonging, and resisting injustice. And what I see as the performative and relational view resonates deeply, really, with the current debates around AI, digital identity system, and algorithmic governance, but also with feminist critiques of power of agency. And I would like to advance 3 points in relation to this. So the first is citizenship beyond law, but in a way, in a different and a hopefully complementary way to what we have heard so far. And I would like to entertain the idea of data as governance, data as the entry point of citizenship and the way citizenship is enacted today. So I would like to connect ISIN's conceptual move to what I call, using admittedly a generic term that several of us have used and keep using, the notion of governance by data infrastructure. Today, our ability to act as citizens is increasingly mediated by opaque digital systems. Think about facial recognition, digital identity wallets, of health scoring algorithms. And these systems not simply support the state, they begin to replace legal procedures and categories. They create categories in a way which is actually possibly even stricter than the law has done so far, because often these ways of creating categories or assigning individuals and groups to categories does not admit redress, does not admit correction. And it's almost like a straitjacket. You place there, and either you belong or you do not belong. Imagine, the binary way of the computer think in, so the zeros and one, sort of black and white. And these categories, associated often with predictive scores, biometric thresholds, and behavioral nudges. So what happens when our citizenship, our right to be recognized and participate, is filtered through a black box of this data infrastructure? We know very little what goes into them, how they work, but we can only observe the outcome, which sometimes for certain categories is particularly discouraging and off-putting. So ISIN's theory helps us to see that citizenship doesn't reside in the infrastructure itself. This is my sense making, so maybe I'm completely wrong. I'm happy to hear some pushback. But it is what people do in relation to it. But we must also recognize that the space for those acts of citizenship, so ways of enacting citizenship, is increasingly structured and constrained by the digital system I just mentioned, that are unelected, privately built, and globally deployed. The second point I would like to make connects with feminist movements and feminist readings of this situation, and refers to citizenship as situated agency. So we can see how feminist theory and various feminisms enrich our understanding of citizenship as enacted. Feminist scholars, and here I'm really butchering decades and decades of fights and struggles and theories, but we can say in a nutshell that scholars reminds us that agency is embodied, situated, and unequally distributed. Not all bodies, and we've heard some categories listed in your talk, are equally legible to citizenship, in the same way they're not equally legible to the infrastructure. Think of how facial recognition fails to identify darker-skinned individuals, or how digital identity systems routinely exclude women without fixed addresses or legal documents. And a feminist perspective pushes us to ask, was ways of enacting citizenship are recognized, and are instead misclassified, erased, or even punished, like excluded completely from what we consider legit citizenship, legally or not. And I think your work gestures towards this in your discussion of the legalities that also activists brought forward. But I would argue that feminist technoscience, kind of in the plethora in the broad scope of feminist thinking, there's also feminist technoscience, shows us that resistance is often subtle, relational, and even domestic. Refusing a scan, navigating a workaround, building care networks around, for example, digital exclusion. So if you want to take these ways of enacting, these creative, if you want, ways of enacting citizenship and planetary citizenship seriously today, we have to take everyday resistance seriously as well. And the third point links to the imagination element, which is very important in your book and your thinking about planetary citizenship. And we might see the connection there between infrastructure and the politics of imagination. So let's talk for a minute about democratic imagination. By democratic imagination, I just recently wrote a pretty vague piece about that. It's a blog post, so it doesn't really have, I don't have to have any empirical data there, so I can really just vent out what I'm thinking about. I was thinking about AI and AI literacy, and then concluding that AI literacy in itself is not enough. We need to rethink how democratic society is designed and whether democratic institutions are fit for the technological setup of today. So I was calling for making spaces and empowering people to engage in democratic imagination. And if infrastructures now mediate who can hack data infrastructure, who can hack how and with that effect, then reclaiming citizenship is also a matter of reclaiming our capacity to imagine alternative futures. And to keep to the reference to infrastructure, so it's our ability to imagine in sense of to prototype, to role play, and to design technologies otherwise. And that's where your book really feels so timely. You remind us that the legal is not fixed. It is performed, disrupted, remade. And we actually need to perform, disrupt, and remake it. And in the context of AI and data governance, this means, for example, that enacting citizenship might include refuse to comply with harmful categorization and or surveillance or similar systems, or even imagining new rights, such as the right to be untracked or a right to algorithmic explanation that we already heard quite a lot about, but it's very difficult to implement in practice and definitely resisted by the industry. Citizenship, in this sense, becomes an experimental practice, not just a legal entitlement, as we have heard. And from a critical data studies perspective, this also means shifting focus from how data represents citizens to how data acts upon them through sorting, profiling, and nudging. And Eisen's work gives us language to describe these moments of rupture, when people push back, refuse classification, or mobilize alternative understandings of themselves and of their community. In my work, I'm studying how people resist algorithmic ID systems by exploiting their technical faults, or how activists expose and subvert the design logics of welfare algorithms. And those of you that have lived in the Netherlands sufficiently long enough, you remember that there's been quite some scandals, and even the city of Amsterdam still implements very questionable algorithmic sorting, for example, of young people. So these are not just technical hacks. They're acts of citizenship, precisely the kind Eisen calls us on to notice and theorize. So can we talk about a planetary citizenship in a data-driven society? I don't know, I don't want to end on a negative note, but what do I take away from your book today? Well, first, the book gives us a crucial language for thinking about citizenship as a practice, not as a possession, one that is even more necessary than ever in our datafied societies. And second, at least from my corner, the corner from which I approach all of this, it helps us to link infrastructure and law, showing that the front lines of citizenship are now as likely to be in a server farm as in the courtroom. And finally, it challenges us to expand our imagination, to see citizenship not only as a response to injustice, but also as a generative force, a way of prototyping more just, inclusive, and participatory futures. So if enacting citizenship in a planetary manner is disruptive, because this is not really what the law is made for, but these ways of enacting citizenship can in themselves make the law, then let's try to continue making the law together. Thank you very much.
Hello. It is also an extreme honor for me to be here on this event with everybody, with my dear colleagues from the UFA, but in particular with Engin Izin. And it really brings me back something like 10 years ago when I met Engin Izin for the first time in person. I had met him on paper in his writings, and in particular in his take on activist citizenship, which I found very inspiring. I will say a bit more about that later. But when I met him, it was actually when a few meters away from here. I met him when the Magda House was occupied. I think it was 2014 or 2015. So a number of students occupied the building, which is actually at that point in time was housing the Rector Magnificus and the CVB, and the central governing body of the university. And it was reacting to, this occupation was reacting to the broader neoliberalization of the university, extreme budget cuts in the humanities, the selling of a building of the humanities to investors. And the occupation lasted 6 weeks, and the Rector Magnificus had to step down. And ongoing from that occupation, a few things happened. But what also happened is that a group of students did the occupation work. They basically put their bodies in there, they were sleeping there, they were cooking there, and we were also teaching there. And I had a bachelor course which was called Political Subjectivity, Citizenship and Belonging, and the students had to read Engin Izin's texts, and the students in my course. And the occupiers, they were inviting all kinds of intellectuals from all over Europe. And wonderful people came, the late David Graeber, for instance, who has died far too early. And Engin Izin also came. And all these intellectuals, they came self-funded because the occupiers didn't have money. So when we heard this, we were super excited because the students were kind of really slaving through the quite difficult, quite dense texts. And now they could speak to the writer himself. And he agreed to do an occupation lunch with us. So we were kind of like sitting there, eating sandwiches with the occupiers, with the students, also with people walking in, because the occupied Magda House was quite an amazing space. I mean, people also from the outside could walk in, people who wanted a warm soup, who had heard, oh, something is going on there, you can just come in. And we were sitting there and having soup and sandwiches together. What was really, really interesting for me, or most, what kind of really sticked with me, is how Engin Izin talked to the occupiers and how he took care of them. And that is by kind of discussing with them what will remain from their work, from their occupation work. And his message was that the transformation you will achieve the most important transformation you will achieve will not necessarily be what happens with the central government body of the university, but it is what's happening among you doing the occupation work. And you have to remember this, and you have to write your own archives so that you don't lose this transformation which is happening. And I kind of was so touched by that because I could see, and we all knew it, and we tried kind of like to also support with that, how tired the occupiers were, how tedious it was, but also what was very impressive, that they did not just occupy, they also really struggled to find good ways how to do the occupation. There were a lot of rules, for instance. There were a lot of ways where you could sleep, where cooking was done. And contrary to a lot of the portrayal of student protest, there was not so much damage done, actually. You know, when you were in the building, people also took really care of the building. They took care of the corners, they took care of where people were sleeping, where people were cooking. They were also cleaning and things like that. And so the message I kind of took from this interaction between Engin Isin and the student was really that how you do your citizenship acts is at least as important as like what happens afterwards. And what is perhaps a bit sad is that if I think back at the Magda occupation, what remained, I mean, there are a few things, like the university has become a bit more transparent. We have like a diversity committee installed and all kinds of things. Darshan actually was also very engaged in kind of getting that discussion going. But like what also remained is a kind of like email list, which is called Rethink the University of Amsterdam. And this email list is now used to mobilize around the violence in Gaza, around the current budget cuts and like that. So in a way, a communication channel has been opened. I don't want to glorify it. It's kind of like a small remain. But in a way, for me, this is related to what kind of, how my work also relates to the topic of citizenship, and here also in particular how Engin Isin has framed political subjectivity, and that is about practices, and in my concrete research field about care. I'm a medical anthropologist. Right now I'm working on aging in an unequal Europe, and this includes research where kind of elderly in richer countries are outsourced to poorer countries within Europe. To be very concrete, German-speaking seniors from Switzerland and Germany are shifted to Central Eastern European countries. And these regions to which they are shifted are regions which have had shifting state affiliations. And some of the entitlements people carry come from these shifting states. It's too complicated to explain that right now, and I also don't want to bore you with Central Eastern European history. I can say it's a dangerous rabbit hole. What I want to point to is one very central feature of the book, and that is what Engin Isin suggests in the book is a theory of citizenship as an apparatus of governance. By that, he kind of traces how citizenship institutes power relations, it gives agency, but at the same time it dominates. So it emancipates and it dominates both. So this kind of double phase we also have in care. You are cared for, but you are also controlled by care. And kind of like this double phase is kind of really go through the whole book. And so it's about this double phase of citizenship, which you gain rights from it, but at the same time, you are also subjugated while kind of accessing the rights. And this is happening by that people are ordered into partitions. That's the word Engin Isin uses. And this is actually also what is happening if you access care. In order to access care, you have to kind of be described for what do you need the care. Think about disability rights. Think about care levels. In the Dutch system, the persoonsgebonden budget, like how much care are you entitled to. And what I find really interesting is like how these categories of difference which describe you, on the one hand, they kind of enact something which is very crucial to your being in the world. In particular, also, it describes your vulnerability, it describes your needs. But at the same time, it always misrecognizes you. You can never be just described, you know, for instance, through your disability. Another thinker, Stuart Hall, has kind of described this as a moment of a suture. It's kind of like the stitches of a wound. If we are identified as something, this is a wound, but a wound is slain into our body, but at the same time it's also stitched. So if we speak from the position from where we get the rights, we do this kind of like in a very vulnerable, wounded way, and we are hurt by being forced to do that, to get that, what is our right. So I'm very interested in two things. I'm very much interested in how our vulnerability is productive. Like that we are dependent, that we're vulnerable, that kind of like produces sociality around us, that mobilizes a lot of things. And among other things, we could almost say it mobilizes a kind of polis around us. But at the same time, the big figure of the citizen as the rational subject is also really challenged from there. I'm working a lot in environments where people have memory problems, where they have different stages of dementia. What kind of citizen is that? Like, what happens to citizenship or political subjectivity if we think it from frail bodies, from the misfits, from people with memory problems? And there I learned to understand that we emerge as subjects being worthy and being listened to by the environments which kind of articulate us as somebody being valuable. I mean, to be very concrete, if a care worker knows the preference of somebody and can kind of like react to somebody by providing these preferences, and this could be like how you would like to have your sandwich, or that you kind of really like to have a warm foot bath before you go showering. You are enacted as a person who can then interact in a very different way, and where perhaps your memory problems are not so relevant. So in that sense, you are then enacted as a worthy subject. At the same time, responding to your preferences is also showing that you are worthy, that your preferences are responded to. So it's these kind of like micro interactions where one can also see something like being a worthy subject, being enacted. And that's where, for me, in a very interesting way, the occupation and care come together. So Engin Isen has written really important things about activist citizenship, where he kind of, and like everybody who is interested in what it actually means to act, like to change something, to become political, I can really recommend reading that and also reading the book, because he also does a wonderful work in guiding us through very, very difficult and complex social and cultural theory, but which has been really important in kind of bringing this into words. So the very idea of when and how is the political happening, it's actually happening, and while it is happening, you kind of also bring yourself to the fore as a new political subject. So this would be kind of like seen in the moment when the students were breaking the door and were occupying the Magda-Haus. You could say this is a very classical activist citizenship act. But actually, doing that and doing that in the Magda-Haus is not necessarily so new. It's also like an historical place. You're actually repeating a script. But in the moment of that you dare to do that, and then also when you are inside, and then when you kind of build your little own polis inside, in the occupied house, that's where the care comes in, and how you relate to each other, and how you enact each other as political agents. That's, for me, how the activist citizenship comes together with kind of a relational care, ethics citizenship, or something like that. I was also thinking that I would like to use this opportunity to ask a few questions about the book. Actually, it's not many questions, one question mainly. I don't know whether any of you has read it yet, or whether you want to read it. If you are affiliated with the UFA, we have access to the e-version, so it's very easy to have access to the book. And that is, throughout the book, you're differentiating between ordinary and official language, thinking politically and political thinking, speaking of the law, speaking in the law. And you relate this to citizenship as domination and emancipation, and that we as researchers take part in that. And I would kind of really like you to explain that again, because I think that is a very important point. In relation to the planetary, I was kind of talking about the occupied Magdehaus. I was talking about care interaction in a care home. All of these are interfaces, and within these interfaces, recognitions happen. Recognitions of the occupiers with each other, with the person who has dementia and the care worker. So what I find very difficult to imagine, if we kind of turn to the planetary, about what kind of interfaces are we talking? So where is the other, if it is the whole planet? This might also be a nice link to what Darshan is going to talk about. But I just want to dwell there a little bit, and I want to recommend a book to you, Orbital, by Samantha Harvey. In this book, we follow 6 astronauts, 4 astronauts and 2 cosmonauts, over 24 hours on the International Space Station, and where they have to do research and everyday tasks, and they have to work together. And we see 16 different sunsets and sunrises from their eyes, because like the station is circulating the whole time. Different weathers, such as typhoons and small rains. And like within that, we see also everything coming back, like everything we have ever thought about climate change, and so on and so on. And the astronauts talk and reflect about how they see the planet and how they feel connected to everything which is down there. And one of the astronauts says, at the very end of the book, if I would see a little mosquito, that's where I see the whole planet in the little mosquito, as I see the whole planet in this drop of rain. So while this is very poetic, and I kind of, perhaps in that story there is already the answer to my question, I'm also very wary of, like, if it is no longer clear what the interface is and from where we are speaking, we kind of return back to a kind of a God's eye view or something, and that is something I'm very scared of. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Okay, so there's some difficult acts to follow. I'm going to do my best. So I'm going to start out with the obvious. All right, Professor Eisen's book is truly a landmark achievement. It draws on decades of his leadership in the study of citizenship to draw together all of the strands of work that have contributed to our understanding of this form of politics. It's more than a book of citizenships. It is a theory of politics itself. It's a theory about how to be political. And in that sense, it prepares us for dealing with many of the challenges of the coming age. Now, the book sees many challenges as worthy of our attention, but the finale is the discussion of planetary problems, where division between human and non-human looms large, and ecological catastrophe emerges as a source of both domination of the non-human and a kind of species-wide self-immolation. Engen writes, "We have become aware of the consequences of our effects on the planet. Whether, and if so how, we can sustain it as our common habitat are now planetary questions." And this is the question that we're dealing with tonight. The work is anything but naive about our chances of dealing with these challenges. And in considering these challenges, there is a recognition of the need to give voice, personhood, and rights to animals, rivers, and earth systems. At the same time, Engen acknowledges that the development of new articulations of citizenship may plant the seeds of further forms of domination, some of which are not completely in view. The majority of the book's discussion of these planetary questions focus on a single planet, the Earth, in isolation from its environment. And here we're talking about the familiar problems of climate change, toxification of the atmosphere, mass extinction, collapse of world food systems, all that fun stuff, as multiple potential sources of the global ecological collapse of planet Earth. And for the most part, these issues are discussed in isolation from the environment within which our Earth sits, the solar system, the Milky Way, and the wider universe. Yet at one point in the book, here it is, Engen tantalizingly offers to expand this remit. He asks us to consider, are non-human species and planet Earth, and indeed other planets, moving from the background to the foreground of politics. Now, Engen, as someone who works on the politics of outer space, that is a red flag to a bull. In the remainder of my remarks, I'd like to attempt to respond to this question, focusing in particular on the emerging engagement of our species with outer space environments. In some respects, our tentative ventures into outer space have been a powerful force for humbling our species, reckoning with the finitude of our existence and encouraging science-based collaborative efforts to solve global problems. Here it's worth reflecting on these two images that have played a major role in the emergence of the ecological movement. On the left, we have the Earthrise image taken by William Anders on the Apollo 8 mission and described by nature photographer Galen Rowell as the most influential environmental photograph ever taken. This image is credited with having, by depicting the Earth as a single ecological system, inspired the early environmental movement. On the right, can you see it? We have the pale blue dot image taken, that's that tiny, tiny blue dot in that white shard of light, taken by the Voyager space probe at a distance of 6 billion kilometers from the Earth. The image was popularized by Carl Sagan's work on the topic, which used it to evoke humanity's minuscule and ephemeral place amidst the cosmos, further emphasizing the fragility of our existence and urgent need to care for our tiny place in the universe. Now, these sorts of engagements with outer space and the accompanying political ethos they evoke are, I believe, in line with the sort of emancipatory politics that Engen is pushing us towards in this book. And they're paralleled by a wide array of concrete political struggles to preserve celestial bodies like Mars for any microbiotic life that may be found there, to ensure that efforts to mine the lunar regolith are either outlawed or made sustainable and proportional, and that the profits are jointly shared equally amongst nations, or to simply clean up the accumulating volume of space junk in our atmosphere. In these small ways, consciousness about the precarity of the Earth as an ecological system is being pushed forth by activist movements out into the cosmos to encourage a form of sensitivity and appreciation for the complexity of our universe and responsibility to avoid repeating the mistakes we have made on our own planet in these otherworldly environments. Of course, the traffic is not all one way. Because as with any environmental problem, there are trade-offs, right? So on Earth, we battle the question of whether dams are clean energy or means of bringing mass destruction to river deltas. In outer space, we debate the question of whether we should scrape the lunar regolith for helium-3 in order to create a radical solution to Earth's energy problems. Furthermore, planetary questions do not necessarily evoke movements to push the circle of inclusion wider and to consider the inclusion of other species and life forms as worthy of a voice and worthy of rights. For some, the primary way to respond to impending ecological collapse of Earth is to draw the circle a little tighter while expanding the scope of human domination to other worlds. Let's take a couple of quick examples. Sorry, I had to do it. Musk believes that the Earth is facing an existential apocalyptic crisis from any number of sources, including nuclear war, advanced AI, a meteor hit, and climate change. In order to address this challenge, he argues that we need to become a multi-planetary civilization so that in the event of the destruction of Earth, humanity is preserved. Hence, we need to go to Mars. This colonization will be driven by free settlers who invest their life savings on one-way tickets to the Red Planet. Bezos. Where we go? Bezos believes that climate change poses an existential threat to humanity. However, the problem is not climate change itself, but the rationing of energy resources required to mitigate climate change and preserve energy resources. This rationing will undermine progress in human experience and creativity. And to address this problem, we need to move both humanity and heavy industry off Earth to these sorts of orbital infrastructures. And these movement to the orbital infrastructures will also be driven by free settlers, at first doing periodic stints and then eventually migrating full-time to outer space. Now, the temptation here is to dismiss both of these guys as wackos, and please do that if you may, and to dismiss their goals as pure science fiction. I would caution against that for a couple of reasons. Well, three. First, Musk and Bezos now have a direct line to the world's leading space agency. Two, both men and their companies already dominate the space sector in important ways. And three, and perhaps most importantly, their ideas are not spun out of thin air, but merely represent more aggressive depictions of consensus positions regarding the development of space exploration in the coming decades. Obviously, NASA has a more conservative and boring version of these plans, which consists of the development of a lunar colony over the next decade, which will be capable of using lunar water reserves to fuel the onward exploration of the solar system. The case I'm making here is that if we're interested in the topic of planetary citizenship, we need to take seriously and engage seriously with the very powerful actors who are responding to ecological crises by literally building castles in the sky. So what does that involve? Well, we shouldn't expect either Bezos or Musk to ever really elucidate anything close to a theory of citizenship in outer space. That's not going to happen anytime soon. Instead, in my work, what I've been trying to do is to interrogate their proposals by reflecting on the political ideas espoused by those who have gone to outer space. But there are about 730 people who have been to outer space. 136 have written memoirs, and I've been painstakingly crawling through them and trawling through them to think about what sort of politics do they describe. I could talk for days, but I don't have that long, do I? So what's the short answer? What sort of politics of citizenship is being constituted in outer space? Well, when Thomas Hobbes famously wrote that life is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short, he was referring to 16th century England during its brutal civil war. But he may have also been referring to the life that astronauts describe in outer space. Why is this the case? Well, put simply, space is out to kill us. Literally, the temperature, radiation, air pressure, micrometeorites, air composition, lack of gravity, and nutrition all create constant threats to human survival, and therefore center the mitigation of death as the basic cause of all technical and political arrangements in outer space. Outer space is not a war of all against all, but it is a deathly and desperate quest for survival, which produces political problems and norms that are very different to those that we experience on Earth. In this context, the non-human is posed as a basic threat to human survival, to be tamed with all possible means. Astronauts and mission control then constantly wrangle over the deathly, unhealthy, and fulfilling conditions of life in outer space. And finally, outer space is a zone of relative unfreedom, where every single action of the so-called free settler is scrutinized and micromanaged down to the smallest detail. From this angle, the question for Musk and Bezos is simply, which of these futures await us in outer space? And by this, I don't mean simply the engineering problems of moving from the stark, lifeless and disordered reality of the International Space Station depicted on the left to the lush and inviting world of a rotating Bernal sphere, the thing that invites Bezos's imagination. I'm talking about the forms of social organization that these two images invite us to imagine. On the one hand, we have Scott Kelly and a colleague just doing what astronauts do, working under the intense supervision of mission control to conduct repairs on an air filtration system, which had been failing to remove CO2 from the atmosphere for weeks, giving the crew headaches, eye troubles, and nausea as a result. In contrast, on the right, we have the glorious lifestyle of the free settler. See, look towards the bottom right of your image. Gathering in joyful and free celebration in their ample spare time, carefree, unencumbered, in sync with their environment, healthy and rich. These two images of the future provide us with a starting point to consider the forms of political order and life that tech billionaires deem worthy and necessary responses to the challenge of existential risk to our planet's future. I've argued that we need to study these futures in the sky and critically unpack their political content as part of our efforts to understand what forms planetary citizenship might take. Thanks.
All right, so let's collect some questions from the audience, and then Engin can respond to those along some of the comments on the presentations. So we're changing the format a little bit. So if you have a question, you can just raise your hand. We can collect about 5 max for now. Does that seem reasonable? We'll see how many we get and then discuss them. Okay, you can just raise your hand. Don't be shy. The back. The front. Okay. Yes, go ahead.
Hi. First of all, thank you for everybody sharing. It was really interesting to know. I'm here because I am trying to use Eisen's theories of acts of citizenship into my own research. And my research happened to be studying Chinese migrants in the Netherlands, and they're claiming of citizenship, kind of, but towards the China state. So when I was listening to the whole panel, it was really fun to discuss AI, data, space, planetary. I am a little bit missing what I am searching for, which is, it feels like everybody's talking about this big topic, citizenship, in a very, let's say, democratic setting. But when I'm doing my research, when my participants are trying to find, even though they don't really know what citizen, or they claim what does it mean to be citizens, they use the word to try to find a political agency. Eisen's theory, acts of citizenship, helped me to find a language to do that. But still, in the discussion and with the theories that I have read, I still am not really sure how I can bridge that and try to communicate what I'm feeling when the claim and the actions does not come from a democratic setting, a liberal setting. So in particular, I'm very interested in the imaginary citizenship. It feels like it seems like it's a concept that can break through, not completely, but the historical and political context of this word. And I would really love to know a bit more about that.
Thank you very much for all of you. That was very, very interesting. I have a question that maybe goes along a bit the previous one, in the sense of you went far to space and everything. But when I think about the question of today, can we get to this universal citizenship? I'm wondering, like, we think about citizenship in the modern times as it's quite related to nation states and the limits of that. We see how the nation states are actually feels like it's limiting us even more, getting us even further away from this idea of having this united thing. What in your work, what would you say are our, where should we go, what direction to get in closer to this idea of having this shared citizenship? Where should we start? Because we seem to be getting further from that at the moment. And in hoping that we might know a world where we are less constrained by nation states, where do we start now? How do we get there? Thank you.
Thank you so much all. It was very inspiring to listen to everyone. I have a question specifically. So I am writing my thesis about indigenous peoples and local communities map making in Indonesia specifically. And in their quest to gain rights, I see sort of two discourses, in which one states that it actually increases the state territorialization, as you also describe. But others also say that it actually opens up spaces for new things to emerge, such as political agency. And also they question what else is the alternative. So then I'm wondering, could you elaborate on, by acknowledging the first, so how this indeed does perhaps enhance this state territorialization and militarization, how, what is the alternative in their quest for empowerment or simply well-being or recognition, or how you want to describe it? Thank you.
Hi, thank you everyone for that. That was really interesting. I'm thinking that if we view citizenship as a kind of active process of engagement with different institutions and places that's usually carried out locally, regionally, nationally, or is rooted in some kind of place, when we're imagining a kind of global planetary citizenship, how are we imagining those acts to kind of come about on a planetary scale? Like, what does a planetary act of citizenship look like that isn't rooted in the usual places and kind of localities that we consider?
Should we take those? Yeah.
Thank you all for your interventions. Really fascinating, searching, opening the boundaries, making connections. Really enjoyed your readings and your incorporation of the work. I've always felt that the work is collective, and we do all our different sort of activities, but the work is collective in the sense that, particularly Christina, when you mentioned about 10 years ago, it reminded me how that collective work involves, on the one hand, activism, on the other hand, some theoretical thinking, political thinking, and how the connections between them become also connections well beyond our local connections, expand. Many of the people I have been in connection with also, I've never met them, and then I have occasions when I meet them, it's almost as though we have met so long ago, and that sense of collective work that it represents. Each of you posed really interesting and challenging questions, and also the audience, you have posed at least 4 really significant questions to consider, and I think I have very limited time to really reflect on them. What?
15.
Okay, and we might have even more questions. I think Stefania's notion of data infrastructures and citizenship. One of the things I take from her work is that increasingly, and I agree, the infrastructures don't themselves inherently either agency or citizenship, but it's a question of how people inhabit those infrastructures and how people are invited to inhabit or interpolated, or in some cases coerced to inhabit those infrastructures. And I think your point about data infrastructures increasingly having become the net, the web through which we act, through which we inhabit our political subjectivity, is really significant. We need to pay more attention to, not only theoretically, but also in our lives, how we became, in a very short period of time, data captives. And I think you will understand immediately when I use the term, from your personal experience, whether you're opening an account, booking a ticket, going to a concert, that you increasingly become a data captive subject, and you're coerced in various ways, poked, cajoled to act in certain ways that you cannot necessarily raise claims against. And this happened in a very short period of time. Data structures is really a significant part of that. So enacting citizenship in this particular moment of data structures is, I think, a really pertinent question. So I'm doing the I'm happy that you're doing the work that you're doing, and looking forward to following further. Christina, thanks very much for reminding 10 years ago that encounter with students, which was a memorable moment for me. Subsequently, I haven't been able to really keep up with them, but the particular energy, particular dynamism, and what I heard when I was here, what I observed, made an indelible mark on how I think about citizenship, because citizenship, as much as exists in law, it exists also in practice and in performance. And unless we perform it in the ways in which we want to perform it in our own terms, actually we would leaving it to designers of laws to describe, or designers of data infrastructures to inscribe how we should act as citizens. So it is really significant to perform with one another and to see its possibilities. But Christina, also, you asked a very good question, and I think Darshan really articulated and answered it on the question of your last question, planetary citizenship. What are the possibilities and limitations of imagining ourselves as planetary citizens? And then you said that if it is developing a God's eye view of the planet, and I think Darshan's warning about Elon Musk's and Bezos of the world are rapidly developing that perspective, and it's not going to be anytime soon they're going to think about planetary citizenship in the sense of against settler colonialism. They are actually leaders of settler colonialism in a different way. So that caution is there, but that caution also has to come with the responsibility of inhabiting the narrative of planetary citizenship, to responsibilize people who are in power, to act in different ways, or at least remind people that there are different ways of thinking the imaginary of being planetary. You said also, said something, I'm going to make note of it, that I have really heard it, but there won't be time right now to address it. And this is the point that Christina made about, at one point in the book, I say, in the ways in which language of citizenship is performed, it advances first in a officially authorized languages and officially not authorized or unauthorized languages. Unauthorized languages about citizenship are often sterilized, anesthetized, and rendered ineligible and unintelligible if one is speaking a kind of language that asks for acts without authorization, for example. It becomes ineligible, unintelligible. And then official languages of citizenship that constantly narrates particular ways of being citizen as the proper, legitimate, authorized ways of citizen. So there's the tension between the two becomes significant. But why and how I introduce that language, we'll have to wait for another occasion. And then related to that, there's also a distinction I make is between political thinking and thinking politically. Now, political thinking is done by authorized people in authorized languages. We are part of that. We are part of discourse that is authorized. We are also powerful brokers in it. We have credentials to speak the official language and so on. But also we try to subvert, critically approach, and so on. But one of the things that we tend to think that in political thinking, that God's eye view of the world, an abstract conception that is applicable to everywhere and anywhere, dominates. That's political thinking, typically the position that it assumes. Typically, not always. Typically the political position that it assumes is that it's from nowhere. It's not situated. By contrast, thinking politically occurs in situ, in particular sites, But it is no less political than political thinking, although it is neither authorized nor official. And the challenge for us who recognize the functioning of this is to find ways of rendering political thinking that is unauthorized, that happens practically, make them legible, render them visible and audible. How that can be done. That is what I'm getting at with that language. And Darshan, we already talked about your really significant intervention on laying out the challenge of how the planetary imaginary is the narrative, is being taken over, already inhabited by powers that be. Those images of white, straight, Christian-looking people, I might say. There is a particular way of describing that. And settler colonialists. So already what we have done on this earth as settler colonists that are being projected now to space. This is, as you say, really dangerous. And against this danger, we have to begin find ways of articulating a planetary imaginary to reoccupy these spaces, that it doesn't have to be that way. In other words, we are in 1492, as it were. And in 1492, there were people who were resisting against colonization. They were thinking of the rights of indigenous peoples who were found there, which the dominant discourse thought of them as flora and fauna. That is, they don't have legal personality, they don't have existence. Therefore, it's open game. We are doing, 500 years ago, the same thing now, without any regard as to what happens to 8,000 satellites when they are launched to enact this project and build these imaginaries. What about the other species that we cannot even name or know about right now? What is our responsibilities to other planets? We have to begin to speak that language, thinking this is 1492, and we have a second chance before we stop a calamitous second settler colonialism. We know the results. And your talk really just like brought that home. And the 4 questions that you posed, really important. I think I'm going to start with the 4th one because it's just immediately relevant to just what we were speaking about. What acts of planetary citizenship look like? I don't know, but I think if our discussion actually enabled to ask that question, we have gotten there. We've taken a step in that imaginary. If we are thinking, what does it look like? And we can actually have a workshop, a seminar, a gathering to look at examples that we might imagine, we might find that people are actually doing planetary citizenship. So that would be very interesting. So in terms of what acts of planetary citizenship mean, clearly the ones that Darshan actually introduced are also acts of planetary something. Not to be dismissed. Not to be dismissed. They are doing something. And that is a dangerous moment. The other question was, how do we, with respect to nation states, if nation states are capturing all sorts of movements within their boundaries where rights actually do not move, and how do we implement universal ideals of citizenship, you were asking. One of the things that we need to lay out and think through is that internationalism, although is the opposite of nationalism, it is not opposed to the nation state. and nation-state organization if we actually bring them together. So internationalism or international citizenship can work, and we have examples of this, legal examples as well. So it's not undeveloped as planetary citizenship. In international citizenship, we have legal examples of national level enactments are not necessarily in contradiction with international development of citizenship, but actually supplement and complement each other. So it's almost as if we have to, for example, find all the rights that we are fighting for in national state laws and their languages. There's no contradiction in that, but also carry out the struggle at an international level and also seeking at the international. As long as we are not moving with the delusion that just because at the international level we have the language of human rights, they are going to take care of themselves. They won't. So nationally or at a state level, push all the laws that you can, and internationally expand all the rights that you can, and use each other in supplement with each other, is broadly, I would say, an internationalist, state-based imaginary of activism. The other question was about acts of citizenship in the case of Chinese migrants, particularly. You were asking the question, like, how do I think about acts of citizenship? I want to, in the case of desires and wishes, difficulties, and the performances of Chinese migrants in the Netherlands and maybe beyond. I was going to say, I wish you were during this, attended the seminar this afternoon we did in the Department of Anthropology and Sociology. In that seminar, we addressed that question, I think, with the participation of really brilliant interventions. I can't go through all that, but stay in touch, and then let's see if we can articulate a response to that question, and then be part of further events that might happen. I think that's all I can say at the moment, because otherwise I would just not stop. And finally, did I get you saying, did I get it right? You said communities map making? Yes, yeah. That's a fascinating question, and particularly in the way in which you approached it. It's like, to what extent you draw the boundaries between co-optation and empowerment. When does empowerment become co-optation? And this is what the double face of citizenship that Gianna talked about in her introduction. There's always the danger of articulation of, I think Stefania and Christina also talked about this danger of, on the one hand, developing the emancipatory potential of rights claims, and where do we draw the line, or where do we develop our sensibilities to sense that expanding, making rights claims are actually turning into also co-optation. I will give you one example. I cannot give you an example from indigenous map making, but I'm really interested to hear about it, so I hope you will stay in touch and let me know how that project is unfolding. But I just want to give you an example of just a couple of days ago, I don't remember where, how, on the question of sanctuary cities, this came up. I was part of a discussion, and the sanctuary cities, oh yes, this was a workshop in Edinburgh, and it was a book being launched on sanctuary cities. A similar problem. Sanctuary cities started as autonomous movement of drawing progressive boundaries around cities in which, against state laws, citizenship can be performed. If state law says you are not a migrant, you are a refugee, you must be deported. Sanctuary city says we're drawing the line. We actually say no to that. We apply a different law. Our logic is different here. This is radical and in its potential as also threatening the very idea of sovereignty. Sovereignty, in the way in which it is enacted, is indivisible. Anything that threatens the indivisibility of sovereignty is an existential threat to the state. And to find the existential threat in the city, within the invisible sovereignty, is a terrible thing for the logic of the state. That's why current US administration can completely berserk about it, because they see the threat. But at the same time, the discussion was sanctuary cities were increasingly incorporated into state logic and practices, and sanctuary cities were beginning to do the work of the state of sorting people into various categories, providing them welfare, providing them help, even in some cases providing the state to deport. So then the question was how, in some places, we got from there, that autonomous space, into this. And so we talked about how it can happen and so on. So this is the question is, how do we then actually detect the dangers of this and, on the one hand, push its progressive and radical possibilities of, let's say, in this case, indigenous map making, but at the same time develop sensibilities that would identify that this is also slipping into a different logic. This is slipping into a different practice. This is slipping into another discourse. How can we establish sort of radar systems that detect these, and we awaken ourselves from slumber and identify them? Does that make sense? Of course, in theory. In practice, it has to be sorted out with examples. Well, I'm going to stop there and thank everyone, all the questions, and I'm again walking away with a lot of stuff to think about.
Thank you so much, Engin. Thank you so much to our panelists, to you all for being here. Do stick around. We have some wine and snacks, and we can start planning our workshop on planetary acts of citizenship. Thank you.